Greetings. Am I too loud? I'm loud enough. You all can hear me. Cool. This is the in-person thing. Like I feel like I shouldn't be mic'd, but we do have online participants who wouldn't be able to hear me. So we'll go through the system just the same. So welcome to See You on the Weekend. As most of you know, this is an ongoing series of lectures that we use to highlight some of the most exciting cutting edge research that's happening here at CU Boulder, conducted by our world-class faculty. Today's lecture is titled A Study of Inequity in Sport. Our speaker is Professor Nick Villanueva, who I'll say more about in just a few minutes. My name is David Means. I'll be the moderator, and I am the director of the Office for Outreach and Engagement, which sponsors this series. We're really glad that you all could join us today, especially with the beautiful weather outside. It's really great to see you all here for the lecture. A few logistics. So as I mentioned, we're together both in person and online. We've got a hybrid format, and this is our second series where we've used this. We're really excited that we can have participants from folks around the state, folks who are at home, and all around the world. Last month, we had approximately 100 virtual attendees, and we received a lot of positive feedback about the hybrid model. So we'll continue to work to improve the format and the delivery. Thanks to everyone in person and online bearing with us as we fine-tune some of the finer points. So now I'll say a little bit about the way we're going to structure the talk. Professor Villanueva is going to present in 3 segments, allowing time during as well as in between those segments for question and answer. Online attendees can submit questions throughout the lecture by clicking on the question, answer, or Q&A button, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom window. Whenever we turn to the Q&A, Professor Villanueva and I will work together to balance questions from our in-person and online audience members. Online questions are not going to be visible to everybody else who's participating in the online format. So I'll read those out loud so that folks can hear them. In-person audience members, you all can raise your hand throughout. I think that's true, yeah. And we'll bring you a microphone. We've got a couple mics that'll be running around the room, attached to one of our staff members, not on their own. Please wait for the arrival of a mic before you begin your question. That way, everyone, both online and in person, will be able to hear your question, as well as Professor Villanueva's response. Closed captioning is available for folks online. You can turn that on using the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window. The online version is being recorded and will be made available on our website early this coming week. For those of you in the room, we ask that you please silence your cell phones if you haven't already done that. Restrooms are down the hallway between the elevators and the stairs. A little feedback there, sorry. I don't know if, okay. And we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that the offices of the Chancellor and the Provost and the Division of Continuing Ed fund this program and make it possible. And we're so grateful for their support as well as our activities in the Office for Outreach and Engagement. So now to the point, the reason we're here, I will introduce our speaker. Nicholas Villanueva is an assistant professor of ethnic studies and director of critical sports studies at CU Boulder. He's the author of 3 books and the winner of 2 national book awards, including the Border Regional Library Association's Southwest Book of the Year in 2017, and the 2018 National Association of Chicano and Chicana Studies Tejas Foco Nonfiction Book of the Year. Professor Villanueva helped create CU Boulder's Critical Sports Studies Certificate Program, which explores social issues in sport and society. Prior to 2020, he served with the United States Department of State and its Sport for Diplomacy program. He also provided critical sports studies workshops for athletes and coaches at the U.S. Olympic Training Center. Professor Villanueva has been recognized by the North American Society of Sports History, and in 2022, he is the recipient of its Emerging Scholar Award. Villanueva's current research examines the inclusion of LGBTQ+ athletes in sport. His forthcoming book from University of Nebraska Press is titled Rainbow Cattle Company, Liberation, Sport, and Gay Rodeo. He currently competes in rodeo with his husband, where they hope to break homophobic stereotypes in the sport. No demonstrations today of rodeo riding, not part of the talk. Got to look for that later, right? Okay. Yeah. So Professor Villanueva was born and raised in Indiana, was a member of the U.S. Army Reserves from 1993 to 2001, and I hear that he's thrilled to call Colorado home. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nicholas Villanueva to See You on the Weekend.
All right, is that working? Yeah, it doesn't sound like it. Oh, there we go. I think it's working now. I usually don't use microphones because I project and I talk a lot. So I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank you for the invitation and I want to first start by saying I apologize if I sound a little congested. I woke up with the flu. It started to hit me yesterday and it has really hit me today. So that said, I wanted to be here so much because I love what I do. I love the study, the critical study of sports. And many people that take courses with me at the end of the semester, I get my teaching evaluation and they ask, why do you hate sports so much? And it's like, I don't hate it. I hate I don't like the social problems we have, not just in sport, but in our society. But I love sports. I watch just about everything. Last summer, I had nothing to do and I mowed the lawn and came inside and saw that there was the oh, am I not loud enough? Oh, okay. Hi, online people.
And maybe yeah, so folks, so we just got folks are online, you can register your volume on your computer. So give that a try if you haven't.
All right. Is this better? Oh, okay. Where was I? So what's that? Yes. So don't even know where I was going with that. Anyways, I love what I do here at CU Boulder. Creating the critical sports studies program was probably one of the most exciting things for me in my career. Getting a PhD was pretty cool too, but that wasn't as cool as for my father as throwing out the first pitch to a college baseball game for Vanderbilt University, and when they were in the national championships. My dad was like, wow, that's amazing. And he didn't even come to my putting ceremony for the PhD. So we have priorities here. But I think the study of sport in society is important because the athletes, they end up becoming these figures that we all idolize or we demonize. And currently I'm teaching a graduate seminar with one of my graduate students here on social justice and sport. And it's important, I think, for us to use sport to bring attention to social issues in society. Now, we've seen that in recent years, with Colin Kaepernick. But let's go back 46 years. And in 1968, we were still having the same discussion with athletes who protested at the Mexico 1998 Olympics. And 46 years later, we're still having this conversation. So my question is why? Why do we keep having this conversation? And I have students in classes of mine that say, well, we've improved by generation to generation, and blame the generations of the past. And I always ask them, like, why do you blame the past generations when we're still having the same conversation? So today I'm going to have 3 segments here. The first segment will be why there's inequity in sport. The second segment will be mostly focused on women. And then the third segment will be about my research, because that's why they brought me here, was to talk about my research as well. So how all of this comes together. So I always like in my classrooms to post learning objectives, what I want people to hopefully take from this lecture today. So you can look at these. I believe this is being recorded, so you can go back and examine them. I'm not going to read them word for word. I hate when people read their slides word for word. But you can see these are the objectives I want to cover today. But one of the most important ones on this slide here, the first one, explain what it means to say that sports are social constructions. And students who are in my class are probably tired of hearing this, but in the first lecture that I'm giving, sports are social constructions because we assign maybe gender to a certain sport, or we say a certain sport might be more masculine, and we identify different sports that way. One day I was at the Nike store at one of the outlet malls, and there was a man wearing this leather jacket and his Harley Davidson on it, and he's holding a little boy that's probably 3 or 4 years old, and they walked by this bin of rubber footballs. And he said, "Oh, you want a football?" And the little boy said, "Yeah, I want the pink one." And of course, I immediately, as the social scientist, I was like, "Oh, how's this gonna go?" And he said, "Okay." And I thought, "Oh my gosh, I have a bias." And I thought that was going to go a different way. We all have different, we have a bias about certain sports. And if I were to ask you, well, I will. What sport is the most masculine? Okay, so one of the attendees said boxing. Why boxing? Okay, sure. One-on-one physical body. Okay, going back historically, and someone said violence is masculine, and that's what we assign to masculine sports, violence. And we watch a certain event and we see someone get hit, maybe in a football game, where the announcers are, say that, "Wow, that was a crushing hit." But when that person doesn't get up, then the audience and the announcers are concerned. So there's this assumption that you have to have violence for a sport to be masculine. Figure skating does not have violence. And so there's, this idea that that's not a masculine sport. If anyone's seen, how figure skaters work out or gymnasts work out, it's intense, it's amazing. It requires a lot of skill. But because violence is not included, we've socially constructed that to not be a masculine sport, or to those not to be masculine sports. So I'm just going to go briefly through this right now. The important topic of the sociology of and study of sport is that not only do we socially create these meanings of certain sports and how they identify, but we maintain them and we change them depending on social issues in society. Key concepts are social interaction, but I'd say culture. So the culture that we have in our society, what we believe to be true about our society. And culture and cultural characteristics involve recreation, arts, entertainment. If you look back into historical societies, every civilization has had these categories, whether they believed in a god or gods and goddesses, or whether they had a political system. If the world was to end and 200-300 years from now, some alien civilization or alien group came to this country and walked and checked and looked around, they might see these golden arches along the streets of every highway and downtowns and think that must have been a religious place. So we tend to try to understand what other civilizations have done, but they generally all have these characteristics. But sport has long been part of different civilizations. I teach a summer abroad course that goes to Greece. And every summer we go and we visit ancient Olympia, Sparta, all these different important historical locations, and examine how is it that athletes for thousands of years have been national figures or regional figures, someone who has represented a nation. And how has sport become something that is nationally identified? If anyone knows the population of Fiji, please let me know, but I think it's less than Manhattan. Yet Fiji won the 2016 Olympic Games in rugby. How is that? How has the United States not been able to produce a rugby team to beat Fiji? So these sports become national identities. And we tend to try and share those sports and those ideas with people globally. So the global part of sports is why I study critical sport studies. It's a sub-discipline of sociology, but it is now the combination of history, sociology, political science, philosophy. There's a course that I helped a young man design called The Philosophy of Sports. I'm not a philosopher. I don't like theory. So that was not my class. I mean, I used theory, of course, but these courses that are developed in other departments, like the psychology of sport, that's a very popular course. I don't do that, but all of us collectively combined create a critical sports studies environment. So why do you think research by myself and maybe sociologists of sports are, it might be ignored or criticized? Well, you have a dominant group in society that doesn't want us to question why men are the dominant figures in sport, why Christian men in the United States, why heterosexual identifying men in the United States, why white men in the United States are all the dominant leaders in sport. If you question that, if there are athletes that defy that, then that is problematic. That is actually seen as threatening to that dominant group. If for decades, or a century or more, they've been the ones in power. And so in critical sports studies, there are many people in the athletic departments around the country that don't like what I do, that I question their power and why they are in power. And if you think about a committee that might be building an athletic center on campus, do you want just one demographic designing that? Or do you want to make sure you include women, maybe LGBTQ, transgender, women, I was just about to say able-bodied. You want to make sure that you have a diverse group of people designing these spaces. Otherwise, someone might not recognize that, oh, those bathrooms say men or women. Let's have a gender neutral bathroom. I know in my building that I work in Ketchum, the top floor where the graduate students' offices are, they have gender neutral bathrooms. And so I appreciate that, because this is what we want to have as far as equality. Now, what I love to say is that my research does upset people. It does disrupt the norm of what we believe to be, or what society has believed to be true about sports. And social life, such as family, education, politics, the economy, media, and religion are all part of that. And so we need to be able to make sure that all aspects of society understand or are connected with equality. Now, this is my favorite quote. I think it defines my research. I will read this one because I love it. It can be said that the first wisdom of sociology is this: things are not what they seem. And that's true for all of us in sociology, not just someone who's biased in one ideology or another, that we all have these biases, and we need to realize that maybe it's not what we think. I had an extra credit assignment for students to go attend a viewing of Barack Obama talking about Black athletes And at the end of it, that front row of students were all women, young women, students. And I said, any questions? And they all, like, almost all of them rose their hands. And I thought, okay, what's going on here? And they said, so what this video really was about was, let's look at Black male athletes, because no women were featured in this documentary. And that was my bias. I supported Barack Obama, so I thought, oh, he's awesome. This is a great documentary. And I did not see that. And so that's what's important, is that we all have biases and we need to identify those. So I said social construction in sport. Well, we construct certain identities with sports. I mean, we do that in society with colors, pink and blue. I don't have my laptop up here, and I have my phone on me because I like to, not be disruptive, but I have the rose gold laptop. I like to say it's pink. And I have the latest iPhone, which I'm usually not that up to date with technology, but had an option to get a new one. And it's purple. I like to just disrupt this identity that we think is normal in society, that there are certain colors or certain sports that are assigned to a certain gender. But race is one of the most misunderstood topics in our society, and not just in the US, but globally. As a concept, biological notion, social construction. I don't know if the online group can see this map very well, but it's a map from 1885. What we would call social scientists today, but they were called scientists, created this map. And they identified regions of the world with certain identities. Now, that was like, over 200 years ago, but that is really when we started talking about race globally. But we have this idea of a Caucasian race. I'm going to critique that one in a minute. The Jewish race during World War II, people referred to Jewish people as being a Jewish race. And then in my research in my first book, in the 1910s, the news media referred to Mexicans crossing the border as part of the Mexican race. Well, what were they before 1820? There wasn't a Mexico. So how is that a race? We've created these concepts. So this is the map. And there are certain areas that were considered part of a certain race. Europe, that blue area, was considered the Caucasian race. Well, there's what is modern day India, Pakistan. And in the 1920s, a man by the name of Takao Ozawa challenged the United States all the way up to the Supreme Court to be declared an American citizen. He was trying to become an American citizen. And the Supreme Court said, well, by the scientific definition, Japan doesn't fall into the Caucasian part of the world. A year later, just 1 year later, the United States tried to overturn, and successfully did overturn, the citizenship of a man, Mr. Thinned and begot seeing thinned, and because he was from what is modern day India now. The Supreme Court said, well, we're not going to use scientific definition from the map. We're going to use common sense because the man was dark complected. So this is how race is socially constructed, and it happens in sport. In sport, we have what we call the great sports myth. And what I always tell people is that they want to break down this great sports myth. You know, these are the critical thinking. Professors always on campus say, oh, I want you to be critical thinkers. And they never tell you what that means and how you do it. So those are my examples. Those are my ideas as far as what it means to be a critical thinker. And it's important for us to reevaluate a point of view in light of new information. And that's the one that's the hardest for some people in sports and in the sports world, in the community. Because yes, they can recognize 1, 2, 3, 4, but not 5. So reevaluating what we think we know about sport and society is important to critically think about and critically examine what we think is true about sports. Now I'm going to get through this in about 2 or 3 more minutes and open it up to questions. But the great sports myth is that your lives are going to improve by being an athlete. You're going to learn how to be a teammate, a positive thinker, a stronger, faster, better person, and your life is going to improve because of sports. Well, not to be too disruptive here, but ask the 220 plus women gymnasts that were exposed to the sexual assault by Larry Nassar. Are their lives better because they were in sports? Athletes that had coaches that physically abused them, like spoke to them in terms that they were worthless if they didn't win. Does that improve someone's life? So I call it the great sports myth, that your life is going to be better because you're in sports. And the media loves to focus on the athlete that came from a marginalized group and came from a disadvantaged background and is now this millionaire and bought his parents or her parents a house. Well, the media is focusing on just that one person. And what percentage of that is part of the numerous athletes that have competed in sports if we go all the way to K through 12? And so this is the dominant group that I had mentioned earlier. And when I say dominant group, sometimes people say, well, there are 60% of the NFL identify as African American. But do they have the power controlling the decisions being made in sports? No, it's athletic directors, it's team coaches, managers, team owners, league leaders, and they tend to more often be male, white, heterosexual identifying, Christian, and native born to the United States. So that's the dominant group. And the dominant group, when I refer to this during this talk, is the group that has the power. Now, ideology, I don't need to probably show this slide. You all know what an ideology is. It's, you know, a belief, but it's a belief that has sort of encompassed the entire, whether it be a nation or a region or even just a campus. And the racial ideology that has long existed in sports really identifies that there are biological reasons why certain groups are more successful than others. In sports in the early 20th century, it was believed that Black athletes were inferior to white athletes. Well, that was because there weren't many Black athletes competing. Sport in the early 20th century, you had to have free time, money. It was largely white middle class. Then later in the 20th century, as Black athletes start to dominate certain sports, then there were social scientists, biological scientists questioning, well, is there something physiological that the African-American race has, maybe a different muscle? I mean, these were things that actually were discussed. So socially constructing it from, oh, inferior to now, oh, natural athlete. It's something that we take away from the actual ability of the Black athlete who succeeds. If you watch, you know, all kinds of sports, like with the Olympics, you would hear the commentators say, oh, he worked so hard and his whole life and was delivered newspapers as a little boy, and it's a white athlete. And then the Black athlete, look at that natural talent. Well, that takes away from the hard work and what they've done to succeed. So that's why I put this X here. Side note, I had a student in a class that saw this slide but didn't go to class, just saw it online, came to my office hours and said, "You're racist," thinking that I was saying this is true. And it was in the lecture, I was saying, no, this is what was thought of for many years. So I've done this so that if anyone doesn't come to class, they see that, no, I don't believe in that. We have the same with gender, that male athletes are superior to female athletes. We have the same with social class, that, oh, if you haven't succeeded financially, then you probably just haven't worked hard enough. When there are people who have a head start, coming from a family with, you know, more support financially, regionally, or where they live, and the opportunities. So the United States is a meritocracy? No. If I had a trash can right here, and I asked you to throw like a little piece of paper up, you might make it in there. I'm going to ask those two in the back, and they have less of an opportunity to be successful. Oops. And then there's the ableist ideology, that people can be classified as normal or disabled. And in my classes, I always talk about dissing the abled. Someone who calls a person disabled is labeling them. But someone who is not of 100% able-bodied might say, well, I have a job, I can do this, I can do that, I can do everything that you can do. Don't diss me. And so that is what I talk about with the ableist ideology. And the problems with these ideologies are the following here. I don't want to run out of time, so like I said, I'll share these slides with anyone who wants them. Leave my email address at the end if you want that. So now let's have a discussion. Do you have any questions or comments about that section of the lecture that I'm giving today? We've got Gretchen running around here.
I was thinking about the whole question also about how different sports are valued financially or monetarily. Even here at the university, different sports receive a lot more funding than other sports. So I just wonder what your comment is about that in that sense, because that's a real inequality too.
Capitalism. The sports that are going to generate more revenue are obviously going to get more attention. But what's frustrating is I've had students in my intro to critical sports studies class. There's one day where we don't meet. They actually go to the rec center on their own and have to examine equity and imagery and everything that is there at the rec center. And more often than not, they come back and write their paper and say, well, we had the men's basketball team poster with their schedule. We had the men's hockey club with their schedule posted on posters. But our top 25 women's basketball team and our top 25 lacrosse team that year and our top 25 soccer team, all three are women's teams. There's no schedule, there's no advertising. So it goes to this topic of people asking, is there an audience for women's sport? Well, I asked the question, have you produced women's sport? Have you showed, recorded it and posted it on, or showed it live on ESPN? Or does someone have to go to an app to really search and find women's sport? So is there an audience? Well, you have to have the sports televised to create an audience. The last thing I'll say about that is the 1999 women's soccer team of the United States, US hosted the World Cup that year, and there were athletes on the team that were upset that the organizers were just going to put the games in smaller venues. So it looked like it sold out. And they ended up hosting them in the stadium where I don't know the name of the stadium, the New England Patriots play. I went to the game at Soldier Field, and then the championship game was at the Rose Bowl. They sold out. So there is an audience. You just have to give them what they want to see. So I hope that answers your question. There's one person behind you that has the mic, sorry.
I've got one for you, Nick, that's maybe a little bit off track, but with critical race theory under attack, race as a social construct, are you feeling that by calling your work critical sports studies, you're getting yourself down a road that might get you in? I mean, what do you think about that? And
Great question. And we were actually talking about that in my graduate class the other day. Critical race theory, very few people even know what that really is. The media likes to call critical race theory basically racist against white people, and that K through 12 teachers are starting to teach this critical race theory. No, they're not. There's not even an undergraduate class on critical race theory at most universities. It's a graduate course. And I took one, and it is about the law. We read books like Whiteness, the law and whiteness. And it's about legally examining race and racism. So we're not getting into laws and legal concepts with third graders, but the media likes to say that, oh, critical race theory, they're doing that all over the country and it's racist against white people. No, every time I hear that on the radio, because I flip through all the channels when I'm driving, just to kind of see how each network likes to tell a story. And I shake my head. I mean, I almost want to drive off the road because that isn't being taught. So to answer your question, critical sports studies here is not a required course. So someone has to want to take the class, want to think critically about sports. And I'm criticized all the time. I mean, I'm on the Boulder Faculty Assembly board for the Athletic Center. And so I'm a representative of faculty members in a meeting with the athletic department. And as soon as they are talking about this and this and this is important, and it's all about revenue and revenue generating sports, I'm always, and what about the Black athletes that are raising or earning that money for you? You know, so I'm not popular with some groups, and I welcome the criticism of what I do. So thank you for that question, because it gets me to talk about what I really get excited about, is disrupting people.
So my question is, I'm going to flip it. What about the athletes themselves within the teams? Does this then move into that arena of the athletes themselves and the teams? Do they see those hierarchies? Do they feel those hierarchies? And do they then translate into whatever they're trying to participate in?
Great question. And that is something that I'd say is more recently happening, where the athletes are saying, I'm using my platform to raise awareness. And not Colin Kaepernick. I mean, we're talking about high school men and women, boys and girls. A good example I have is, I want to say his name, but I don't think I can because it's recorded, but a student that was in my class, one of my classes, he was a senior, he was on the football team, African-American, and at the end of the semester, of the fall semester, he ended up going to a conference for African-American athletes and awareness in sport. Don't quote me on that. I don't remember the actual title of the conference. And he represented CU Boulder. And our athletic director, I can mention her name, Chris Livingston, or assistant athletic director of education, Chris Livingston, spoke to me one day and said, let's say his name's Nick, because my name's Nick. Nick went to this conference and is now interested in getting involved in athletic departments as a representative once he graduates, because he wasn't going to go pro, in racial justice, social justice. And it just felt really good. So there are athletes today, I think more so than ever, who are saying, I can do that. I can, you know, change what's wrong with that. All right, any online questions? Nope. Okay.
Which I was going to let folks online know that they can put their questions throughout.
Oh, okay.
So attendees who are online, feel free to submit those questions throughout the talk, and we'll make sure to get to them when we get to the discussion sections. Thanks.
So these are objectives I want us to be able to take from this talk today. The second one there, understand what it means to say that sports are male dominated, male identified, and male centered. This is the topic that I'm going to talk about now about women in sport. There's different ways we think about sexuality, femininity, masculinity in sport. And there's a term that I use in class, that one of my students here probably could say right now, is appropriate femininity. And this idea of appropriate femininity is the idea that these women might be strong and successful, but then they also, outside of the arena, outside of the court or the field, have to identify as feminine. And we don't have the same with men. We have with women appropriate femininity. And a student of mine on the basketball team told me that there's a vanity in the women's locker room for her team, because they have to make sure that before they go out and play, and this is the basketball team, they have to make sure they appear appropriate. They have the makeup that, you know, is something that you can wear as an athlete. And then afterwards, before interviews, they have to make sure that they have made themselves look appropriate for the audience. And I didn't know that. Yes.
Elaborate on it. Was she telling about that, or is that like
She, and this is only something that I was told by one student, so I can't say this is across the whole country. She said that her coach told them all to at least go through the vanity area and check their appearance. So I don't know if that's, you know, true across the country. So great question. So I can't say that they have to, it's suggested, I guess. Right. And female coaches do this as well. Female coaches do this as well. They, I took my students to a women's basketball game and they had to write about gender. And students pointed out that both head coaches on either side that were both women wore suits. But underneath, one had a lavender blouse and one had a pink blouse. So there was this balance of femininity and yet feeling as though they needed to use a suit to look strong or masculine. So it occurs, that appropriate femininity occurs not just with athletes, but the coaches as well. So I'm glad you asked that question, because I would have forgotten to mention that. Or maybe it's on another slide. Oh, I don't know why that's doing that. All right, so gender ideology in many societies is based on this two-category classification. And as we know, most of us know today that some people don't identify with the gender neutral. But in sports, you're either male or female. You're either heterosexual or homosexual. This two-category system has long been believed in the world of sports, which is why there, for many years, have not been athletes that have been out of the closet, openly identifying as homosexual or with a same-sex partner or pansexual. And this two-category system, I always say, created a don't ask, don't tell environment. And if you know don't ask, don't tell, it was, you know, a term in the military that President Bill Clinton put into law or signed into law that the military leaders could not ask someone if they identified as gay or lesbian. They didn't use many of the other terms at that time. But then also, if you were identifying with the LGBTQ plus community, you couldn't openly display that. So it was don't ask, don't tell. That still continues in sports. It's an unwritten rule, an unwritten law, if you will, but it's something that still exists today in many sports. And this has to do with this longstanding ideology of gender in sports. So I mentioned male-dominated, male-identified, and male-centered. This is how I break them down. But male-identified words, images, language, largely associated with masculinity, manhood, and men. And it's been done this way since athletes were little boys and girls. I mean, we have the phrase tomboy for a little girl. But what's one of the first football games little boys play? A scrimmage game called Smear the Queer. Yeah. Some of you are nodding, you've heard it. Some of you maybe have not heard it, so thankfully you haven't. But that's a game where a football, the person that catches the football in the air is then tackled by everyone else. How is that not similar to a hate crime? But it's taught at an early age to use that word in a disparaging term, whereas us academics, we say queer identity to include everyone that identifies in an LGBTQIA plus category and lifestyle. But it was used as a disparaging term. So that's why I wanted to point out male identified. And in sport, girls are seen as invaders. Girls and women. The girls and women that are now coaches in sports on football teams, for example, or referees in the NFL. Women are generally only considered for 50% of the jobs in the NCAA. Why? Well, the NCAA's athletic departments aren't going to hire a woman to coach men's football. So if you think about it, men have the opportunity to teach or coach, I keep saying teach, coach any sport. But women are largely considered for only half the sports in the NCAA. This is just a slide. Briefly, I'll show that girls in K through 12 usually only had like 1 or 2 field days a year to participate in sports prior to the late 1970s, and yet there were boys teams for certain sports. But ladies, not invaders, and I should actually have ladies in quotes, because what I want to stress here is that certain sports and sport teams, women and girls are referred to as ladies. But the term lady and ladylike to some women in the 70s was something that seemed disparaging. And we still have the Lady Buffaloes, the Lady Volunteers, the Lady Bulldogs, these Georgia, Tennessee, these teams, it's still used today and has become commonplace with a younger generation, not realizing that it was used inappropriately during the 60s and 70s. And then when there was the passage of Title IX, women being referred to as ladies, not women's teams, but lady teams. And so it's a bit confusing, and I wasn't alive then, so I don't historically know that. I just know that through the reading of feminist critiques courses that I've taken. So progress towards gender equity has occurred since 1970 because of government mandating equal rights, the global women's rights movement, global health and fitness movement, increased media of coverage of women in sports, even though to this day it's still about 6% of the media coverage of sports includes women. I don't remember what year, I think it might be 2010. The University of Minnesota women's hockey team went to the Frozen Four, the Final Four of hockey, won the championships. It wasn't televised. But that day, they did televise on ESPN a young 6-year-old pool-playing prodigy boy who was playing pool. Yet a championship game of an NCAA team wasn't televised. So yes, there's increased media coverage, but from what? From nothing to about 6 or 8%? That's still not, in my opinion, total progress. This one I just want to point out that I hope everyone in this room, or most people in this room, identifies as a feminist. And by feminism, I mean the social, political, and ideological belief that there's a goal to establish social and political economic equality of the sexes. So if you say you're a feminist, you just believe in equality. I have a student that once said to me she wasn't a feminist, and I asked why. She said, well, because I'm pro-life. I'm like, what? And she had this assumption because some feminists have a certain belief that they follow, that she's not going to believe in that. And I just said, no, this is the definition. And she still didn't follow me, but feminism, you can be a man and be a feminist. And I always say that to my male students. And I love it when my student athletes in the class, the male student athletes, are like, I'm a feminist. So Title IX, this is the government legislation that I want to mention briefly here, that it started out with the Equal Rights Amendment of 1972. Basically saying that if you pay taxes, then your public schools should allow equality for everyone, not just put the money towards boys and men and their programs. Well, that led to universities, high schools around the country questioning, well, what about scholarships then? And what about sports? It became a sport topic. It was initially about education and educational support and finances. Well, then following this, the next 2 or 3 decades, you see this huge increase, and I'll have a slide coming up real quick, a huge interest of and participation of girls, K through 12, and women in college participating in sports. But there was an unintended consequence that happened. See, these young women in college, they actually played on teams, but they were clubs. And those clubs didn't have hired coaches. They were volunteers, maybe someone who just graduated and wanted to stay with the team and decided to coach. But when you made this a financial opportunity for someone to be paid to coach, these male athletic departments hired men. So women were forced out of these coaching positions because of what I called, what I had on the other slide, male-centered environments. One thing I want to disrupt here, and then we'll get to a few more slides and get some discussions going, is the idea that Title IX killed men's sports. That's something I hear all the time. That, oh, because of Title IX, my university no longer has men's swimming, wrestling, men's gymnastics. In 1977, the NCAA regulated that there would be equity in scholarships. Football gets 85 scholarships. What team in women's sports get that? It's football that killed men's sports in the NCAA because there's no equivalent on the women's side. So you can have more women's teams if you have 12, 14, 16 scholarships. But how many are you going to give to the lacrosse team or the rugby team or cross country in men's sports if 85 are going to just one sport? So that's how the idea of what killed, if you want to say killed, men's sports happened. And so just a brief here, Title IX killed men's NCAA sports. Well, actually, men's sports increased over the years. Yes, women's increased a lot more because there were programs finally. And the same with collegiate participation. So I already said this, Title IX does not force schools to cut sports for boys and men. Men's sports are declining because of Title IX. No, we saw the data in the previous one that they've increased by 15%, and require school to spend equally on male and female sports, and that still is false. Covered that, sorry. Don't mean to be repetitive here. And coaching. That's the example that that women in coaching positions since 1977 has decreased with every sport except for soccer, I think. Yes. Yeah, is that right? Softball. I don't know if they're lining up right. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Soccer. Okay. Sorry, I don't know why that looks distorted. It looks right on my screen. And the historical problem with gender in media. This is one of the last slides I want to go over until we have a discussion. Gender marking. Why is there the NBA and the WNBA? Well, if it's just the NBA, then one seems less than authentic, less important if you have to mark it. Thankfully, the NCAA basketball tournament, if you watch it this year, whether it's the men's or the women's, you'll see they no longer refer to it as the men's NCAA basketball tournament. There's no marking And the NCAA has embraced this idea of understanding the problem with gender marking. Compulsory heterosexuality, well, discussing someone's male or female partner that is of the opposite sex and making sure that they refer to, there's her husband in the stand. There's his girlfriend with his parents. Appropriate femininity, I talked about that, act like a lady. Infantilization. How many times do we hear the word guys or men and not boys? Yeah, baseball, there's the term boys of summer. That's about it. But you can often hear announcers refer to the girls on the team. Non-sports issues, I saw this in a documentary. There were two women swimmers at the NCAA championships, and the announcer said that they used to be best friends, but one stole the other one's boyfriend. What does that have to do with the championship swim? And sexualization. Well, just watch women's beach volleyball and ask yourself, if they're wearing that as their uniform, why aren't the men wearing Speedos? Because, and the beach volleyball is, I believe, fourth in popularity behind gymnastics, swimming, and track and field in viewership. So there's obviously this sexualization, and it will be showed in prime time. It won't be one of those you have to kind of search on, NBC Sports at 3 p.m, which I do sometimes when I watch the Olympics. And that also reminds me of a men's water polo game where the announcer said, "Wow, this is truly a man's sport because of the fighting underneath the water." Have you watched women's water polo? they kick and punch just like the men do. So coaching, administration, and underrepresentation. One of the things, so I can get to a break here and have a chat. One of the important elements of this is that there is this men's club, men hiring other men. And men hiring other men. And what we call the male-centered group, of course. And then barriers to gender equity, budget cuts, privatization of programs. Let's see. Trivialization of women's sports, like I said, with the 99ers, the women's soccer World Cup. And then the male-dominated identified centered sports. I'm going to pass through this one real quick. It's just coaching statistics and get to I mentioned the idea of homophobia and the don't ask, don't tell. Sorry if I'm moving so quickly. I went on too many side topics that I only keep you here for 3 hours. Any discussions, questions that you may have? Yes.
Hi, I was 11 when Title IX passed in '72 and was avid baseball player with my brothers and could never be on a little league team. Even after Title IX, I couldn't be on a little league team. And when I went to high school, I went to a private high school because that's the only high school in my town. So I had no choice. And because it was private, Title IX doesn't cover private education. So have you done any studies Or do you have any information about the number of high schoolers who were eliminated from having coverage by Title IX, women specifically? Where it's this general idea that it really solved the problem for girls being involved in all sports equally, but it leaves out that one little aspect of for public funded schools. And is there anything on the docket to expand that to private schools that don't get public funding?
Great question. And early on, no, the schools like your private school and universities like Princeton University didn't have women's sports until like the late 1970s. What happened was in private universities, you had at the same time professors that were teenagers during the civil rights era and women being hired as professors. And so you had this push for equality at the private universities as well. Stanford is a good example. They eliminated a mascot that was Native American, the image of a Native American, before that was a discussion in sports. So you had this movement within academia for equality. Now, in high school, that was more of a slower trickle down. And you still, to this day, have schools that are pushing against, say, changing their mascot, for example.
So we have a few questions from our online audience.
Oh, hi.
One goes back to the slide where you were comparing the numbers of scholarships for different sports. This attendee is wondering, how does the amount of each football scholarship compare with the amount of the typical women's scholarship? So, and how do basketball scholarships compare in amount when men and women are compared?
Well, the basketball scholarships, I believe, are both usually 12 at a university. But comparing men's football, the point of that slide was to show how many teams could be represented in men's sports if football didn't take 85 scholarships. Now, if your question is about the balance of power as far as scholarships, it tends to mostly be representative of the student body, which to this day now is closer to 50-50. But in the NCAA in 1977 wanted to make sure that the scholarship representation was in line with Title IX, in that there was equality in the amount of money that was provided for scholarships. I hope that answers your question. Yes.
Hi, I have a two-part question. The first one is, so you talk about this concept of appropriate femininity. For women in sports that are seen as more masculine, do you observe there being a sort of limit to this appropriate femininity, where if they're too feminine, they're seen as girly and aren't taken seriously in that sport? And then the second part of that is, for women in those more masculine sports who are openly queer, openly LGBTQ, do you feel like that shakes up the sort of public perception of how they're supposed to perform femininity?
Oh, that's the second question I'll address first. A lot of people are misunderstood or don't understand that women that identify as maybe part of the LGBTQIA+ community are scrutinized similarly to men. A good example of that is the Penn State basketball team. I'm forgetting her name right now, but the coach for about 15 years or so, she was she was incredibly homophobic and transphobic, and she would do what's called negative recruiting. She would go to potential student athlete houses when they were recruiting, and she would ask what other schools they were interested in, and then she would say, "Oh, I know there's many lesbians on that team." And if the young woman identified as a lesbian, well, then there was this, if she was not out, there was this self, closeting of, well, I can't go to that team because someone might think that I'm a lesbian. And so you have just as much criticism and scrutiny with women. I was interviewed by ESPN radio when Michael Sam, I was forgetting his name, Michael Sam came out of the closet during the NFL draft. And they said, "What do you think about the first professional athlete coming out of the closet?" I'm like, "Well, we've had that for decades with women." So there's definitely a gendered aspect of that. Now, your first question, can you ask that again? I'm sorry. I don't do good with two-part
Sorry,
questions.
no, it's okay. My bad. I was just wondering if you feel like for women who were in more like masculine sports like boxing, if you feel like there's a limit to the appropriate femininity, where if they're seen as too girly, then they're not taken seriously in that sport.
That question, you finally stumped me. I don't have data on that. So I can't answer that. I could only give you my opinion, and that is that there is most likely scrutiny because of the term appropriate femininity and why we use it to make sure we feminize these strong athletes. But I can imagine that the opposite would occur where there's scrutiny if there's too much femininity. But again, that's just an opinion. I can't say that with any data.
So we have time for maybe a couple more questions, and I'll do one from the online audience if that's all right.
Okay.
So what will the effect of NIL be to women's sports? And I don't know if you can speak to that, explain to us what NIL refers to.
Yeah, NIL, name, image, and likeness, has been huge for women's sports, actually. Sports, if you were to be a fan of maybe women's gymnastics, some schools, they have maybe 100, 200 attendees. Then you watch Alabama or Florida, these schools that are powerhouses in gymnastics, and they sell out the arena, and their athletes are getting commercials in their local community and contracts with, I think one was a local Ford dealership. It was a car dealership. And so I see that name, image, and likeness is beneficial to young women in sports.
I was thinking about sort of the ownership level, but then I also thought, well, what about international? Do you understand what's going on for women in sport internationally? Is that something you've been looking at?
Yeah, I think I was introduced as saying that I worked with the State Department, and I worked with the U.S. State Department on a program called Sport for Diplomacy up until COVID. And then they suspended the program. But I met with, their priority was to meet with women coaches globally. And in Latin America, I found very few attendees. That has a lot to do with, and not to stereotype or anything, I do research in Latin America topics, this machismo idea, this idea of being masculine and manly. And so in sports in Latin America, I find less coaches. So I had less actually come to the program. Yet in Europe and Eastern Europe, I had, or what we would call Eastern Europe, many women coaches. And so as far as ownership, haven't studied that. But as far as head positions and positions of power, I find that Europe has been ahead of the United States as far as this cultural change in sports.
So we're running into the end of our time here. We might have time for one more question in the room. Is that Charlie there?
I've seen the documentary LFG about the U.S. national women's soccer team and
Which-
their suit. LFG,
Oh,
the
okay.
documentary. I don't know if you've seen it.
No, I haven't.
Okay, it's about the U.S. national women's soccer team and their suit against the Soccer Federation for equal pay.
Oh, okay.
By the way, if you haven't seen it, you should see this.
Oh,
film.
no, now I know what I'm doing.
You should also
tonight.
you should also see Athlete A about the Larry Nassar scandal and the U.S. all of that. But I just wanted your comments about that suit and whether you see the economics of sport intersecting with the work that you do and how you see that playing out.
Okay. Well, with the economic of sports and the lawsuit and equity and pay of athletes, I think that the global sporting community is going in the right direction as far as equality and pay. But in the United States, and I don't mean to be a critic of capitalism, but the capitalist idea for sports is still dominant. And so there are critics of or supporters of the current policies with men being paid more than women in their argument that there's more revenue generated from the men's sports than the women's sports. However, again, I go back to if there's an audience, there will be revenue. So I don't see positive, massive change in the near future. But what I have seen is that we have some sports that are now competing with both gender identity competing together. Swimming, I was at the Pan American Games in 2019, and they had mixed relays. So you had 2 men and 2 women on the mixed relay doing all the 4 events. And it was so exciting because you never knew who was going to finish because things were changing often. And at the 2020, they call it 2020 Olympics, but in 2021, they had the same in track and field. So I think the more we see this blurring, if you will, of the identity of gender versus this is a man's sport, this is a women's sport, we're not going to have the change, but I like the direction I've seen us going as a society and a global community.
All right. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there. So I'll move over here. I've got a few remarks to just close us out here. And first and most importantly, of course, is to say thank you, Professor Villanueva. We so appreciate your time, sharing
Thank
your
you for being
expertise
here.
with us. Thanks to all of you for being here in person, and to those of you who attended online. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your Saturday afternoon. As I mentioned, the recording of this will be available this next week if you want to share it with folks who weren't able to be here for whatever reason. So I'd also like to acknowledge the Office for Outreach and Engagement staff that has been working behind the scenes that make these events possible. Really appreciate the hard work of our staff. All right, so the mandatory final remarks here. This is the first of our spring series. We have 2 more events in this series on March 4th, online and in the same room. We have a program titled Music of the Long 70s. And on April 15th, you can join us on East Campus in the Smead Aerospace Building for How GPS Changed Everything. There will be tours of aerospace labs available before and after that lecture, and you can check out the website for details. So we do really appreciate the feedback from all participants on these events. We take that into account as we plan future lectures. So let's see, on the screen is can we click forward? Gretchen, is that right? We have the QR code. See if we can just go to the next slide. Oh, oh, the good stuff that
Yeah, I didn't get
we'll
to
have to say
get
for
to my
next time.
research on the LGBTQ rodeo.
So a future lecture in that case.
Actually, there's a YouTube video from a
great,
conference I
great.
spoke.
Awesome. So folks can look that up. In terms of feedback for us on the lecture and the series, you can use that QR code and complete that digitally. We also have some paper copies available for folks who want to fill those out in person. You can see Ariel back there has those. Grab one of those, fill it out, and we'll collect it before you leave. Folks who attended online will receive a link to an online survey by email after the lecture. So I think that I've said everything I need to say. Is that true, Gretchen? Okay. Really appreciate you all, the intellectual community that we managed to build around these events and others, rooted here in the work of our faculty at the University of Colorado, is a really wonderful thing, and you all make it happen. You are where that really lives, and so we are grateful for your presence and your continued participation, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the weekend again in March and in April. Have a wonderful rest of your Saturday. Thanks again to Nick for making it
Thank
happen.
you. And you can find my information about me on the ethnic studies website at CU Boulder. If anyone wants to receive a PDF of this PowerPoint presentation, because I know a couple slides I had to go through a little fast. So don't hesitate to contact me about that, because it's out there anyways on the websites somewhere. Thank you.